Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit about exposition. Two different approaches to exposition, in fact. Indirect exposition versus direct exposition, and how you're going to see them in both the literary world and in the cinematic world. Direct exposition, as you can guess, is where you're going to tell the audience directly whatever you need them to know. So if you open up the first page of The Hobbit, that's going to be direct exposition. In a hole there lived a hobbit. Hobbits look like this. They have curly hair on top of their feet. They're shorter than dwarves. This is what their holes look like. They're not dank and damp. They have round doors and round windows, and back end looks like this, and all the windows face this way. That is going to be direct exposition. You're saying something right to the audience in really plain language. In fact, that's the way most books began, most classic books begin, with a certain amount of direct exposition before you get to the actual plot exposition. And most books combine these techniques, by the way. If they're using direct exposition, they will also use indirect exposition mixed in there, just depending on what needs to happen. But that's not the only way that you can begin a book. You can begin a book with what's called indirect exposition, and you can use indirect exposition throughout a book. And in fact, The Hobbit uses direct exposition throughout the entire book. Indirect exposition is where you're just going to present a scene and with all the characters, and the reader or the viewer, if it's a movie, they have to infer the details of the exposition through the action that they're watching. So you kind of synthesize the exposition. If you were to rewrite The Hobbit in an indirect fashion, you would just begin with the first scene of maybe Bilbo and Gandalf talking, and you'd have Bilbo look up at Gandalf above him, and that would let you know that Bilbo is short. You'd have Gandalf duck through the round doors, telling you that the doors are round and that Gandalf was tall. You might have Bilbo scratched the mat of curly hair on top of his feet. No, hobbits have big feet with curly hair, right? You'd figure this stuff out, or you'd sprinkle the details in throughout the first scene. So that's the other way that you can do exposition. Now, one of those is way more popular now in modern literature than the other, and that's indirect exposition. Direct exposition's kind of fallen out of popularity over the last few decades, even though most classic literature begins with direct exposition. And I think there's a few reasons for this. I think some of it might be coming from like the academic area, like writing professors who are telling their students to always show and never tell, or something like that, or never do direct exposition, even though the books that they like have a lot of it. And I actually think it's not just that anyway, but I think readers actually like indirect exposition to an extent, because you can begin right with the action. And so that can be very gripping and very interesting, to just begin with action and then kind of figure out things as you go. The action can really hook you in. The other thing is readers and writers as well have been subjected to years of cinema experience. So I think cinema does influence literature in this case. Cinema is almost entirely indirect exposition. And there's a reason for that, is that direct exposition is unnecessary in most cases. Why? Well, think about the direct exposition of The Hobbit. This is the way hobbits are. You don't need any of that if you can just show what a hobbit looks like. So because you have a visual medium, you can just show, here's a hobbit, he's smaller than this wizard, he has hair on his feet. You can just show all of that information. You don't have to tell the audience that kind of information for them to understand what's going on or what they should expect from hobbits. You can just show it. Likewise, if you have a movie set in New York City, you don't have to describe New York City. You can just show it. If you have a setting in some futuristic city with crazy computers, you can just show the computer behind the character. You don't have to talk very much about it. However, there are some big exceptions to this. Oddly, even though cinema is dominated by indirect exposition, there's some movies that begin with direct exposition or use direct exposition throughout in the form of narration, or having a narrator kind of tell parts of the story that are missing along the way. A really famous example is just Star Wars. Star Wars begins with that opening crawl. That's direct exposition. That's the way the movie begins. It tells you all the stuff you need to know. There's this Death Star, this evil empire. It gives you the critical pieces of information for you to understand the first scene. Now, you could skip the crawl and pretty much understand the movie eventually, but George Lucas really wanted to set that up so you had this idea of who was evil and who was good right from the get-go, and you could figure out the heroes and the villains quickly and with ease and get into the action of the story. Another really famous example is actually the Lord of the Rings movies. Begin with direct exposition, not the direct exposition from the books, but a different kind. They talk about the history of the ring. You have Galadriel saying, there were these rings of power, and here's what they were given to, and you have some assisted visuals of like dwarves, and then there's a battle. You show how the ring got lost by Isildur. All of that's direct exposition, because it takes place before the story. Even though it's visual and you have a visual representation, you have a narrator telling you the important information you need to know. And all of that sets it up so everything's crystal clear for the audience when the story begins. And that's the big advantage of direct exposition, is that you can be really, really clear and precise with your audience, and you can make sure that nobody gets lost along the way. If you're doing things indirectly, it may get confusing if you're not highly skilled at it. And there's a couple ways that you can actually very slyly combine these two things. You put in some direct exposition midway through the narrative in a way that people don't recognize it, because you do it through dialogue. One of the ways that you can do it is a very famous trope in fantasy, what I call the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court trope, which is where you take someone from our world or somebody who's in a very unfamiliar world, and then they ask all the questions that you would ask as the audience, and characters then tell them the answers, which is the exposition of the setting. So a really good example of this is actually not this. This is not really a fantasy novel, but this is kind of the setup that I see used all the time. A really, really good example. Now there's so many fantasy examples, but one that is probably not obvious is actually Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. Wheel of Time, very famous fantasy series. It's got like 13 books, and some of them are less good than others, in my opinion. But the way the books begin, all the protagonists are from this podunk village. They're from the Two Rivers, right? And this podunk village knows nothing about the outside world. They know virtually nothing. So when they are forced to leave, there's a big action at the beginning, and then they have to leave. They end up having to ask questions along the way and have characters tell them how the world is, because they're so like out of the backwoods. So it's like, oh, what are the Aes Sedai? The Aes Sedai are this. Ajas are this. This is how this works. This is how that works. We're going here. This was a city that was this. There's a lot of telling to the characters because they don't know what's up. And that's a way that you can kind of very slyly directly tell the audience, but you're doing it just one little layer removed by having one character tell another character. So this is, somebody said in the comments, like, I was told to do all exposition through dialogue. It's like, you can do it that way. That's a little setup that you can use to do it. On the other side, you have indirect exposition with none of that. A really famous series, The Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. In some cases, you don't have a firm grasp of how certain things work in the universe till many books into the series, because he never tells you. He just skips explaining things and just shows you the action, just shows you the scenes and the characters. And you are the as the audience member are spending time synthesizing all the rules of the universe and how the magic system works. And he does this in a lot of different ways. When you read Gardens of the Moon, it opens up with mages like blasting this thing called moonspawn, and you're not quite sure even what moonspawn looks like, and you don't even really know what it is until I think 3 or 4 books into the series. You have an idea finally what I first thought it was like a floating castle, and then later I realized it's not that. but you figure it out as you go, as details are revealed, and you kind of figure out how the magic system works as details are revealed. And they show you a couple things at the beginning of Gardens of the Moon to get the basics, and then the deep stuff's revealed later on. So that's a great example of indirect exposition. However, that's the big thing that keeps people from reading Malazan, is that it's really confusing if you're not like a diehard and willing to read deep into it to figure out what's going on. So a lot of people try to read Gardens of the Moon and they put it down because it's confusing and they don't feel like it makes sense or they don't like it. And that's the drawback of that. Because you are not able to be really super clear with the audience, it's not obvious what you're doing. So you can do either one. Now, the thing is, I've done both. So in Muramasa, I actually begin with indirect exposition. I have like a little blurb of something that's written, which doesn't really explain much, but kind of piques your interest. And it's just a little page that has something that was written on a scroll. Then you have like an act 1, and then you have chapter 1, and it begins with dialogue. What sort of man does this? The floor, it is ruined, right? And you're like, who's this guy? Who's he talking? You just start with the scene, and you figure out the rest as it goes. And because it's set in feudal Japan, that's a setting that most people don't need a whole ton of explanation to figure out. They need a little bit if you're not super familiar with Japanese history, but I kind of give that as it goes. The relevant stuff is sort of given as it goes. This book has a controversial beginning, I suppose. Some people didn't like the beginning of this book because it begins with direct exposition. It begins with Helga was. Helga was a young woman grown from an impetuous and difficult to satisfy girl. Started with direct exposition. People are like, it starts like a fairy tale. It's like, well, it's direct exposition. I wanted it to be like classic fantasy. Now I could go back and take that feedback and revise that and get rid of that direct exposition. But I don't know. I may want to keep it in there. I chose to do it because it kind of sets up all the relevant information for what ends up being the ending of the book and does it in just a really obvious fashion. In both of these books, I actually set up in the first chapter how the ending happens, which, you know, I don't know if everybody figured it out with these or if I was like too subtle. But that's I've done both, and I'd say I've gotten more people objecting to the direct exposition in this book than I've gotten people ever be confused with the indirect exposition in this book. Most people are smart enough to figure out stuff as you go, and you probably don't need the direct exposition. This one is more contemporary. It begins with indirect exposition, and in fact uses indirect exposition throughout the entire book, with a couple of cases where you have to ask a character how something works, like I mentioned, Connecticut Yankee kind of trope, because one character doesn't understand something. And that's a chance to deliver exposition through dialogue. So hopefully that's a little bit interesting. If you want a great example, a cinematic example of indirect exposition of the setting and characters and plot, the whole bit, very, very much in one scene, watch the beginning of The Godfather. Because they don't tell you, oh, this is a mafia don, this is the way the mafia works. All of that's done completely indirectly in Francis Ford Coppola's movie. You have this first scene with this powerful don, this guy asking a favor, someone getting married. You get that there's rules involved, and you start to immediately understand the organization and that this guy's at the top. It tells you everything you need to know right from the beginning. We'll make him an offer he can't refuse. It's subtle, it works, and as the movie goes through, you never notice that you really needed any help figuring it out. It's really, really well done opening scenes and throughout the movie as well. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Patreon is up, patreon.com/David V. Stewart. If you are a patron, you're going to get this book for $1. If you want to give me $1 a month, you'll have access to at least one book, changing every 6 to 8 weeks. It's going to be Muramasa for a while. If you are on the $5 level, my Thought Criminals, you'll actually have access to like my whole catalog. So if you want to read any of my books and you want to be a patron, the $5 level will give you access to all of them. So have a great day. And if you enjoyed this or got some value out of it, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, or drop me $1 on Patreon. I always do appreciate it. And I'll see you guys next time.